Good evening, subscribers. Welcome to episode 2 of 1984 and 2017. This is Oliver Damian. I'm here in Sydney. It's 9:32 p.m. on a Sunday night. And we have Peter Twig in Canberra. How are you, Peter?
Hi, Oliver. Good to talk with you again. And very interesting what's been happening over the week in America with the Charlottesville situation and, of course, ongoing fallout from that. It's shocked a lot of people, I think, at how the civil disruption is happening. And, of course, a lot of people are trying to find meaning and direction in all of this. It certainly is not a healthy trend that's emerging.
Yeah, and it's again, like in the last episode we discussed on the Google memo, and I think here again we're seeing how the media is piling up on one side of the issue, right? Well, there's that, and then there's also they're polarizing. The right-wing media is saying one thing, and the left-wing is saying one thing, and it's really hard to know the truth now. So we're talking about Orwell in 1984, but I think we also need to rope in Marshall McLuhan. I think it's has something to do with the media, right? The medium is the message. So that now
the media used to talk about the fairness doctrine, where they were committed to the fairness doctrine of presenting equal-sided arguments, but it's no longer like that at all. And the fairness doctrine has definitely gone out of the window, and people are no longer talking with each other in fair, open debate. It's just screaming at each other, usually over barricades now, and the violence is very real, very palpable in the way politics are heating up. The irony of this is that, if I can reflect back on economic and political history, is that we saw this set of circumstances in the early 1970s and the late 60s with the civil disruption with Martin Luther King and the emergence of black rights, and at the same time political confidence started to fall with Richard Nixon in the early 70s, which led to the Watergate situation. Ultimately, economic confidence fails, and this repetition of a trend is seemingly starting to come clear. Economic confidence will always fall after political confidence falls. And at the moment, the foundations of American politics has been shaken, in fact, in every liberal democratic country, in Australia as well, very deeply, very deeply.
Yeah,
and if we can take this a step further back to the time zone of 1740 to 1785, we see that there was also a time in France where very high taxes, very high levels of regulation, tariffs on goods coming into the country. There were a lot of impoverished people. There's high unemployment, and this led to the French Revolution. And also in 1776, we had the start of the American Revolution well and truly underway. And this is all about a struggle against oppression by the political class, the elites. In America, that was against the tyranny of King George III and the heavy taxes he was imposing. And then also in France, the heavy taxes and the heavy regulations placed on the French people between 1740 to 1785, which ultimately culminated in the French Revolution. And so when we look at this time, and given the level of economic growth and economic activity we've had since the mid 18th century, we've gone a long way. And of course, what I'm suggesting as someone who's absolutely fascinated by cycles of human endeavor, that we are starting the downward phase of a economic and political cycle, which will reflect the intensity and the capacity the 1740 to 1785 period experienced. So we're in for rough times ahead, and you can see this on a cyclical basis. You can see this in a political, from a political lens, from an economic lens. Things are not right out there, and it's time to prepare for the lifeboat. Maybe another 5 years before it actually starts to really hit the fan, as they say, but surely it will.
Yeah, I guess the only countervailing, yeah, but if you really look back, I actually see this as having started from the GFC. This is
exactly, yeah.
So when you say, I think they go hand in hand, but I think the real breaking point comes in when the economics becomes bad. Like even in the most repressive countries, there's like a certain order until people get hungry, like what happened in Syria, what happened in Indonesia. When people start getting hungry, they revolt.
Exactly right.
Yeah, and then when things are good, some people overlook repression, so that's also dangerous. But once people get hungry, that's when things dissolve. But the thing with the West is it's really funny. Like with the American, it's actually the rich who are leftist. Yeah, they're the ones who want socialism, which is bizarre, right? And it's actually the working classes on the right of the spectrum, which is quite an interesting phenomenon, right?
That's a paradox, isn't it? Yeah.
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 Yeah,
And
and then
I'm wondering if that happened because people who were there in the 50s and 60s and during the boom times, we're talking about the baby boomers and the Generation X, who experienced the fullness of employment and a burgeoning economy and what have you, that sort of they're holding on to that sort of idea or set of values that it's a strong economy that creates wealth, that creates a comfortable lifestyle, and they're actually clamoring for that past.
Yeah, and it also has to do with the rise of identity politics and what the students have been learning. Because I think what happened was the academia was infiltrated by it was taken over by the not infiltrated, but it just went overboard. That you're like an endangered species if you're a conservative in academia. So we're churning out all these graduates who have a different way of thinking about the world, who I think because once you substitute identity with citizenship, it becomes a weird thing, right? Because there used to be, like back in the Roman times, if you're a Roman, you're a Roman citizen, regardless of what color of skin you have,
True,
regardless
yeah.
of religion, regardless of your origins, as long as you pledge allegiance to the empire, you're one of us. It's a citizen. But now I think we're going back to tribalism in a weird kind of way.
That's true. It's also when tribalism always increases when people become uncomfortable or uncertain about the future. And since the GFC in 2008, 2009, people haven't been able to see the way forward. And you saw the Wall Street movement post 2008, 2009 that sort of sprung up because of all the unemployed people. They were demonstrating against Wall Street, and yet as soon as they started to get jobs, that movement actually sort of died down. It's because people were satisfied. They were no longer angry. They were placated, basically. That allowed that movement to sort of kind of go underground again. I'm sure that it will come back, of course, when unemployment starts to rise again. But for now, this is where George Soros, from what I understand, reading websites like Zero Hedge, has been a major sponsor of leftist movements trying to stir up trouble and chaos within the political and economic systems.
Yeah, and I think this is where I'd like to bring in, like, Nassim Taleb is now writing this book that's about skin in the game. And I think a lot of the problems in the society we're having now is the people who are taking risks don't have skin in the game. You could start with the GFC. It happened because these bankers were playing with other people's money.
Yep.
And then when they succeed, they get all the profits, but when they fail, they get bailed out. So I think people are really bitter against that, and we should all be bitter against that, because all these people, they get
Yeah,
they get this they got to keep the bonuses, so they
yeah.
get the upside and we get the downside, and it's
But
also happening. Yeah,
whose fault is that really? If we're really honest and look at the situation of the bankers being able to game the system, they have gamed the system. There's no doubt about it. This whole issue sort of falls into the guise of public choice theory, where the bankers game the system and they've reaped all the rewards,
yeah,
very high incentives. But because the governments have come in and guaranteed depositors
deposits. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah,
deposits, then the bankers can gamble with all the money in the world. They've lobbied the politicians. They've made changes to the various banking acts around the world, and there's only one thing that governments can do to really respond to the
I think
power.
you. I think you're hitting your microphone. So if you avoid hitting the
Sorry,
microphone, yeah, yeah,
sure, yeah.
cool.
If there's only one thing the governments can actually do to counter this situation, and that is to increase the statutory reserve deposits, the liquidity ratios required by banks to hold certain numbers of deposits in bonds or in cash as a security margin against that against the potential of some sort of economic crisis. So at the moment, those liquidity ratios stand around 10, 11, 12%, but to have them sitting at 20, 25, 30% kills the incentive to stops the ability of the banks to gamble, to cancel the depository insurance requirement that banks have on depositors' funds, so that the liability rests once again with the people who's put their money in the banks to be more diligent, but also to say to the bankers, the gloves are off, and you have a key position in a modern economic economy, and to risk your position and endanger everyone else is not acceptable.
And yeah, there's that, but there's also the fact that when you mix deposit-taking institutions with derivative trading, I think they're fundamentally incompatible. That because real banking used to be a boring business, and that's remained like that. And I think all the risky stuff should be like in hedge funds. Like hedge funds blow up all the time,
That's
but
true,
then
yeah.
yeah, but they don't get bailed out because they're small enough. And like even long term capital management, they have skin in the game, because people, it's usually in hedge funds are usually partnerships. So you're more careful because you can tend to lose all your wealth. So there's skin in the game. But if you're work for Citibank or all these big banks, you're just an employee. Like that guy in Singapore who destroyed Barings. One
Yep.
20-year-old made a trade that killed 100-year-old bank, you know?
Yeah.
And then they've lost more money than they've ever earned since they started. So there's no skin in the game, because yeah, you're like fresh out of uni. You know what I mean? And then you're given this thing, and to you it's just numbers, but these numbers can actually affect the life of everyone, you know? Everyone's superannuation. And then because there's no
That's
feedback.
true, yeah.
Yeah, like Nassim talks about, like the roads are quite safe, because if you're a dangerous driver, you get taken out, like you die in your car. So all the bad drivers get taken out of the population. But bankers, they just recycle. The same people who caused the almost collapse the whole financial system, they're back. They're back in
That's
the
true.
banks. So they're free again to wreck the whole thing again. Whereas, and even like, so, well, that's the financial world. We translate that to politics. It used to be that before we have the system we have now, the presidents, like Napoleon Bonaparte, he was on the battlefield. It's like anytime someone wages war, they could die in the war, you know? But now presidents don't have skin in the game. So they can just start a war and their kids won't go there. So I think you can have a rule that if you want to start a war, you should send your children to that war. If you really believe in it, then send someone
Mm.
that you care about. So that you have a skin in the game, so you'll think twice, right? Because if you're just sitting in Washington or in Canberra, it's just so artificial, you know. There's no when you have skin in the game, you're gonna think twice. Oh, if I do this, my own son would go to war. Do I really want to do this war? Whereas if you're not personally affected, to you it's just a decision, but you don't know this decision creates millions of refugees, and
Mm.
you know what I mean. It's become
So
an abstract thing.
if you're not a politician, and say you're just a public servant, a government employee, then how do you have skin in the game, though? Because these government public servants are actually coming out with policy initiatives and putting out policy that's affecting millions of people. And in Australia, for example, there's 23 million people. And policies do have huge impacts on people. And some policies, of course, work very well. The implementation of superannuation was probably the last policy I saw that had a huge positive benefit to Australia.
Yeah. I mean, there's the thing. There's that thing again, because that happens when you have centralization again. That's why the EU is quite in trouble, because like let's say you're in Brussels, how would you know what's happening on the ground in countryside Spain, right? Because if you live all your life in Brussels, so I think there's a wisdom in making, like in complexity. What happens is all the complexity arises out of local interactions. I think the focus should be in local interactions, so it's really bottom up rather than top down. I think it's the top down that fucks it all up, because the top of the pyramid is so far removed from what's really going on. But if they control the resources, then the resources get misallocated, and the feedback system doesn't work, and you can create dangerous, vicious cycles, you know.
So I want to write an article. I've been thinking about this for some
Yeah.
time now, because I think we're really getting ready for a phase where it's what we call the 4Ds. It's decentralization, which is this moving from a centralized process system where many liberal democratic countries are highly centralized, into a decentralized situation. You deleverage, which is about reducing the level of debt. What's the other? Deregulation, because there's far too much regulation that's driving people. And as Frederick Hayek said, what better way to enslave a people than to enmesh them in a fine set of regulations? And the fact is, you don't know when you're breaking the law, because there's so many regulations that sort of are stopping you, or that drive your what you can and can't do. It's very easy to step over a line and get done for some particular crisis. So writing about the 4Ds is I believe is the next stage liberal democratic countries will go through when they sort of start this whole unwind process. And you've prompted me to actually
I totally am on board with that, and I actually believe that that's the future. Because if someone just understands complexity, they'll know that it's impossible to control. And the only thing you can watch are the local interactions. So,
but it also makes sense that it's also cyclical in nature, this centralization, decentralization process. And so it reaches an extreme, the yin yang of centralization, and before it starts turning the other way. And it's human nature. Because if we relate this to the politics of Charlottesville, for example, it's this situation where here's a generation out on the streets, sort of chanting slogans at each other, not listening to any rational discourse, and it's groupthink as we connect into 1984, which is driving a set of behaviours and a set of beliefs and a set of attitudes, and it's also the people who, their parents and their grandparents are the people who fought against, totalitarian forces, the Nazism, fascism of the 20th century, communism in North Korea, South Korea, Vietnam as well, and it's the parents who've gone up against that and who may have experienced the aspects of totalitarian government or regimes that are now saying, whose children are now out there demonstrating, calling for socialism, calling for left-wing socialist policies to drive their country forward. And how bizarre is that? It's like within one generation we've lost that. And as you say, part of that is the education issue, that sort of where academics have captured the field of education, and that flow through to the children is now sort of coming back to haunt us.
Yeah, and I think another thing is I think we should I don't know if it's possible that we come to a non-narrative way of thinking. I think it's people get lost in narratives and anecdotes and stories, and they believe a particular story and they see everything from the lens of that story, and you lose all the complexity. So yeah, I don't know who said it, but like when we discovered the microscope, we see little things, and that advanced science a lot. And then we discovered the telescope, and we see far things, and that advanced our civilization as well. But we haven't invented is a macroscope. It's where you can see the totality, the complexity. And I think that's the next invention that we need, that humanity needs to advance, because
we better get that quickly.
Yeah. But funny enough, I link this to AI and machine learning. I think in a funny kind of way, people are demonizing AI. They're gonna take over it. Actually, that technology could help us understand complexity, I think. Because like machine learning, it's a network learning. It's a network of neural network. It's a neural network, most of them. So it's really learning from the network. So that's what we want to see, because a lot of, like, let's say a lot of economics is right now, we're at the level of economics where you pretend, all right, let's stop everything, and then we'll just look at this little part of the economy, and then we'll make this, keep other variables constant, and then we'll do these equations, and that will translate to the magic. But the world doesn't work like that. But that's how it's being taught right now, right? It's just like, oh, it's just interest rates. But when you move that, everything else is moving, right? It's not just, we're still linear in our tools in the way, but there's already a lot of things out there which we haven't really applied yet, but it's starting to filter in. Yeah.
It's actually worse than that, but never mind. Let's move on. Otherwise, we'll get very depressed. I think
the
you're right
economics
about
pretend to be a science, but the way it's practiced now, it's not really a science. I think.
That's so true. So I think you're very right about artificial intelligence. And one thing artificial intelligence will teach us is that it makes war so totally terrible that people will not want to go to war, I believe. And so maybe the one benefit of artificial intelligence, above all others, not only being able to think about complexity, but being able to resolve war as an issue in human endeavor and human life, and because it will just be too terrible to contemplate.
Yeah, and really, if you think about it, democracy, politics is an algorithm, like one person, one vote, and then you divide the country. It's an algorithm filtering choices. So if you want to advance, what's happened is we haven't updated this algorithm for hundreds of years, so we're behind. We need to come up with new, like money. Money is a hack. It's an algorithm as well. Like we'll assign this value to this paper or whatever, or this concept. And I think we're with cryptocurrency, we're getting there. We're experimenting more. Yeah, it's really like it's rules we make up together. Really,
it's spontaneous ordering, isn't it? Yeah, it's spontaneous ordering, which comes back to
Yeah.
the decentralized approach of looking at one little individual and seeing how they interact in their environment, and then being
Mhm.
able to see that over in a complex sort of situation. And it's that spontaneous ordering, which I find always amazing when there's an election going on, to be able to perceive what is the spontaneous order trying to say, trying to express.
Yeah.
And it's just like a marketplace, you know, like a vegetable market, where you have the interactions of buyers and sellers all doing their own thing.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just gonna pull out a video and just to see. I just want to show people how a very simple example of how emergent order happens. So, have you seen this video? Maybe I sent it to you before. So you
No, I
have
haven't seen
here,
it.
it's a pendulum, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then see, they're gonna imagine this pendulum are people, you know? Imagine this pendulum are people, and then they're gonna do their own thing. So they're gonna, or it could be the market, it could be, so they're just gonna do their own thing. But see, something will emerge. There's no leader, no one's controlling them. But see how many kinds of different orders emerges out of this, out of autonomous. They're not linked. These pendulums are not linked. You see it?
Yep, it's quite extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah. And this is what we're learning in complexity. You actually, in a way, you actually don't need to wait on Trump. You just need you just need to provide people with enough autonomy, and there should be a way for us to communicate with each other, and that's all you need. Order will emerge. You don't need a strong leader like the linear narrative we've been like here. No one pendulum is leading it, but see, they form order,
Yep. Yeah.
and this is
And
a
so,
non-living thing, you know.
so this taps into one of my favorites. That's John Stuart Mill.
Yeah,
And what is human flourishing? And while people still believe that they need a leader or a government to be in charge of them and to look after them, there can be no real human flourishing. And that when people really stand up above the memes of left versus right,
yeah,
you know, sort of politics and economics, and they really become a human being, and they really reach their full potential.
yeah,
That's when human civilization will have advanced to a level where it'll just be totally amazing. And I'm all in favor of that. But the question is, what does it take for human beings to drop the assumption that they need to be led, that they need a government in charge of them, that they even need nation boundaries? It's to determine who they are and
yeah.
what they are. I
I mean,
love that.
I think it's slowly arriving. Like for people who are outside Australia listening to us, we're in this ridiculous situation that in our country, the main issue is dual citizenship. Like a government is about to fall in Australia because they didn't check the citizenship before they become. So on one hand, those politicians were slack because it's a requirement. You should have done it. Like, why did you fail to do it? You should have renounced whatever. But on the other hand, it's ridiculous. But because these people never even set foot on those other countries, they don't live there. They weren't even born there. It just happened that one of their parents lived there. It's a technicality. But at the same time, it's so simple. They should have done it. So
It's
it's just
true.
like
Yeah.
you can see the incompetence on many sides. So
So true. Yeah.
yeah, like you're in charge of a whole country and you can't even manage to check your citizenship. I don't know. It's just like interesting.
Those are dangerous words, that they are in control of the whole country, and
Yeah, and then
yeah,
they fail to tick a box. Whereas if you were a citizen who does that, you get fined. Like, you know what I mean, with the tax office.
mm,
If you miss the technicality, then you can end up in a bad way, right? But
yeah.
then we'll see what the high court says actually. So it'll be interesting. But it's
Well,
almost comedic that, and I think that's what's happening is that I myself, I believe there should be no professional politicians. I think
Mm.
leading a country should be like, it should be like a duty, like jury duty. There shouldn't be like a person who graduates from high school, enters politics, and that's all they do all their life. I don't think someone should
I,
specialize in politics.
I totally agree. So term limits
Yeah,
for politicians, and maybe 9 years, that's 3 terms as politicians. And then if you happen to be the prime minister on your third term, then you could maybe stay on for one extra term if you're lucky. Um, I've thought about this a lot, and that is a major solution for Australian political process. More important than whether we become a republic or remain
yeah,
under a monarchical constitution situation. That argument's irrelevant. We have to get the career politicians out of the game.
yeah,
Another solution would be to put them on the average wage for Australians, which is about $55,000, and yes, pay them some help money for postage and running their offices, but keep them on a lean, mean leash, is what I say.
yeah. Or even, why can't we have like the jury system for politics? Let's say for the Department of Economics, you just get a certain number of people randomly that have a stake in whatever decision is gonna be made, and then they just vote on it. And then after that, you disband them again. You pay them while they're doing that. So it's more fluid, right? I think it's possible. So you don't get
That's
lobbyists. You know what I mean? Like every citizen will have a chance to vote directly,
direct
but not
direct democracy. Yeah, I've thought
with.
about that. And when they were talking about the Australia card in the 1980s and 1990s,
Uh-huh.
and they were looking at doing that. And so what we could do is go online and actually vote with our Australia citizens card, and go through once a month and tick off yes or no on various bits of legislation.
Yeah, or
Um,
or even
yeah.
even that you could also be like a jury duty. Like, let's say we're gonna look at amending the, let's say, the Telecommunications Act. So they'll pick people randomly, people working in the telecom industry, people working in, anyone who has a stake in it. Then once you're selected, they'll pay for your living expenses to go to Canberra for, let's say, 6 months, while everyone talks about it and what needs to be amended. You know what I mean? Like, you're like a politician, but only for a limited period, and then that's it. You've done your duty. So politics doesn't become a privilege; it becomes a duty of everyone. That would be interesting, actually.
Well, that has merit too. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
and that touches on customary law, where a group of
Yes.
elders may actually be the judicial and regulatory system for a tribe of people.
Yeah.
Somalia, for example, before the warlords, was a very highly regulated and very happy, harmonious society until it fell apart under the influence of war and different competing factions, and the emergence of the warlords totally destroyed the country. And but customary law, it's the law of torts, in other words. You being a lawyer
Yeah.
would understand that fully. It's this historical body of law that's accumulated over several thousand years that sort of has a bearing on decisions that are to be made.
Yeah. That's why
That's still been trashed.
I love. Say what you want to say about the United Kingdom, but their law is unbroken since 1066, and the common law is such a genius invention, and it evolves. Like, there's still some good law back in the Middle Ages, as long as it hasn't been superseded, it evolves. It's an evolutionary kind of law, which
Exactly, but
is different to what happened in France, where they had the revolution and Napoleon rewrote all the code. So that's top down.
exactly,
Yeah.
yeah,
The real common law was, as a judge makes decisions in particular cases, you build it up over time so
yeah.
that it will evolve. As a society evolves, the law evolves, and you don't get all the gaming that happens when you have legislation that's written.
Exactly, yeah. and also the legislation that's influenced by people. By people coming in trying to get their special interests needs met.
Yeah,
Um,
the
and
lobbying, the professional lobbyists. What kind of job is
exactly,
that? You know.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah. So
Yes.
how do we relate this to 1984?
Well, in 1984, I guess one aspect of that is where does Winston work? He works in the Minister of Truth,
Hmm.
and then and his task is to rewrite history, right? To rewrite the news. To yeah, let me just. So really, it's about control, which is
Exactly. And
top
so
down, really top down. Yeah,
one of the amazing things is to see these statues in America being pulled down because they represented an aspect of history which is unacceptable to some people.
they
I
don't
mean,
want it.
they don't want that history, and so they want to write a new history for themselves. And to me, that seems so trite. I mean, the American Civil War was not about slavery. That
Yeah,
was it was 2 years into the American Civil War before uh, Lincoln actually re- renounced slavery in the United States. It was the Civil War was about the Confederation of States versus the Union, as in a centralized form of control over the whole of the United States of America, where the Confederacy states wanted to have their own autonomy. Um, so
yeah,
that links in with our discussion earlier.
yeah, and also it's so unfair to judge people of the past using the moral compass we have now. Like slavery was part of the society for a long time. The Romans had slaves. All the philosophers that the socialists would now admire, like Plato, Socrates, they had slaves in Greece. So and then are we gonna say they're all bad people now because there was a time that was accepted? You know, it's unfair because if the people judging them now lived during that time, do you think they'll be against slavery? I don't know. It's hard to say.
Exactly, because
Yeah, we're judging
living
them on hindsight, you know?
exactly, and that's the thing about being achieving human fulfillment, uh, and that is to be able to step above all the memes to be the best you can possibly be, and means having to renounce every single meme that shapes who you are in the world to
Yeah.
be so that you can become more fully who you can be. That's such an important aspect of the human direction and uh, the need for human change.
Yeah, and also, yeah, in the last, Nassim was a guest again in Econ Talk, and he talked about how maybe some slaves in the Roman times were better off than free people today because we are really still slaves now. We're wage slaves.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
but back in like the Roman times, they took care of their slaves because they were property. I know it sounds bad, but people tend to take care of their property. So they actually were careful not to harm their slaves because they're valuable to them, right? Whereas now,
Mm.
if you fall out of the system, no one cares. You just end up on the streets. But the slave owners back in the Roman times, they'll take care of their, you know what I mean? Because they're
Yep.
property to them.
Yep.
I know it's weird to saying it that way, but because now we're coming from hindsight. So and also you don't need a revolution to get rid, like the UK got rid of slavery because they just thought it's a bad thing and they just made it illegal, right?
Yep.
In
It took them a
they
long
just
time to do that, though, but they got
but
there
they
in
did
the
it.
end.
They by an act
Yep.
of parliament. They did it, you
Yep.
know.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's and and I was thinking like, what are the things we are doing now that future generations will judge us for? Oh, look at those people. Will
Mm.
they be burning our websites because we were so backward in things we blogged? Yeah, you know what I mean? Like in the past, people they have statues because that's their media. What's our media now? Like YouTube, like will they be erasing all our cat videos because look at all these people wasted their time with cat videos? And is that the thing we want? We erase the past every time we progress.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Though history has a habit of rewarding the winners, and the losers lose their history.
yeah,
Their history is subsumed, and it's crushed, and it's gone. So there are vast chunks of human history which we just don't have a clue about because it's been subsumed by a competing group that's come along and taken over.
yeah. And I think that's where again we go back to our initial discussion of complexity. That only happens when you think there's one linear narrative. But
Mm.
if one has a way of complexity, the more narratives you have, the better the system becomes.
Yeah,
Because
the more
this,
dynamic and healthy. Yes, exactly.
yeah, and then you're also more anti-fragile. The same way with the way we do crops now. Like when you're monocropping, you're really fragile because if like what happened in Ireland, they had one species of potatoes, and then when they were hit with the blight, they become hungry. Whereas if they maintain a lot of different varieties of food or potatoes even, they wouldn't have been wiped out. So in the same way with culture, when you have one culture, if that culture becomes corrupt, then you're fucked. But if you have 1,000, then there's still 9,999. You know what I mean? That's how Mother
Exactly. Yeah.
Nature does it. That's why Mother Nature is not efficient. That's why I think this doctrine of efficiency is dangerous.
Mm.
Because if evolution was efficient, we wouldn't have two kidneys, we wouldn't have two lungs. We'll just you just need one. But then
Exactly.
yeah, you need redundancy. That's like why
Mm.
there are like thousands of species of butterflies. Why? But because it's better to have
Mm.
variety, and that's where the
Yeah.
diversity comes in.
Yeah.
But the weird kind of way is the diversity people now, they're the ones suppressing diversity. It's just like double thing. That's what's happening.
Mm.
Like it's just saying truth is war is love, and truth is
Yeah. So whenever we see a political system where there is a lack of diversity in
in thought. Yeah.
debate and thought, sooner or later it has to fall over. And so we look at Nazism, for example, and the brainwashing. They were able to sustain it for from the early 1930s right through to 1945, but
Yeah.
the system eventually fell over. Similarly with Italian fascism in the 1930s and 40s. We look at North Korea and sort of, which is very current at the moment, and how long can that stay alive? You have a dictator there who leads through suppression of his people by fear and violence, and because there's no infiltration of new ideas or other possibilities, the people don't have a chance to stand up at the moment. But sooner or later they will, and then that will fall over. The dictators of North Korea will fall over. So we live in hope anyway.
Yeah, and so we'll practice what we teach. So I'll pull in another lens in this. Another lens you can look at it is like National Socialism and fascism and all that really came about because of media. That's why remember there was a manual on coup d'etat. When there's a coup d'etat, the first thing that you take over is a TV station, the radio station, because it was at a time where mass media, where the means of media was controlled, tightly controlled by a few entities, and
Mm-hmm.
that's how you brainwash the people because you. That's how Russia did it as well. They control the news you see. So like, and my mom is Vietnamese, and they had like uh she had relatives living in the north, and then one time they visited them in the south, and then they brought rice and food, and then they said, "Why are you bringing food to us?" Oh, because we were told in the north that the south is poor. So they were brainwashed that saying that the south is such a bad country. They're starving. They're being mad, and then they were surprised when they saw the south. Wow, they're richer than us. You know?
Mm.
So I'll be surprised, really. I don't know. Maybe it's true that North Korea is bad, but maybe a part of it is over exaggerated by the reporting. It can happen. Maybe we're all
Exactly.
brainwashed to think that it's bad inside. But and I think the interesting question is, whenever we invent some media, the intention is to be used by the people, to be democratic. Like when we invented writing, it was for everyone to be writers, really. But what happened was writing was controlled by the scribes. So they had the power. They consolidated because they had the access to the alphabet. Not everyone could write. So then when we invented printing, it is supposed, yeah, it should democratize everything. But for a while, not many people wrote, and printing was controlled by big publishers, right? It became centralized. And the same with radio. Radio was supposed to be for democracy. It was, but it was also co-opted by the totalitarian regimes. They controlled the radio and the television. And now the interesting thing to see is what will happen to the internet. Will it go the same way? I don't know. Like we now, it had a democratic intent, and but now governments are trying to control the internet, and they're trying to get all our data with the NSA and all that, and then now they're using it for cyber warfare. So it's interesting how, if the internet would go the way of a mass media where it was co-opted by totalitarian. I don't know if it's possible, because the very design of the internet is it's distributed. But I don't know if they could find a way to even co-opt that. So it's going to be an interesting question. And then the side effect of the internet is you create bubbles, you create echo chambers. Like same people talk to each other, so they just become more extreme because they're so far from, at least with the mass media, you kind of like, because the newspapers were all a hodgepodge of many things, you're likely to encounter things you haven't thought about, and you're likely, if it's balanced news, you're likely to encounter things that go against your thinking and makes you think. But now you can just stay in your own group of friends. You're sharing the same thing
on Facebook, no less.
Yeah. So, and it's
exactly,
hard.
yeah. So a similarity to the internet situation, from what I understand, the government does have a choke point on the internet so that at any stage they could actually switch it off. And the same situation applies to digital currencies as well too, where I'm a firm believer that there needs to be competing currencies to the standard government issue money that is on offer. And this is one way of checking inflation, because when a government starts to print too much money, then people can convert their money into other currencies, and that competition helps to keep governments in check. But governments also have the ability to choke off digital currencies, and this happens at the exchanges. When people go to convert their money back into a currency, they can close that door, and through the banking system. And for that reason, it's like until that the government has lost total control of the internet, total control of digital currencies, will there be like a freedom of expression for people to be able to
I don't think right now there's a choke point in the internet, because a lot of maybe in the addressing, in the way you do the DNS, but even there, I think you can design that to be. But that's why I was worried about the Google thing, because actually people like Google and Amazon, they're the ones who own, because they own their own pipelines. I think they bought some pipes that link countries, like the fiber optics. So unless the government takes over Google and people like who own the actual fiber optics, they can't really stop the connection. And then, and also it'll be like suicide if you start. Like even China, people are, even if they try to censor it, people can still go through using VPNs and all that, because you can still connect to China. If China really wants to control that, then they should take the whole country off the internet. But I don't think they want that, because they also want to be connected. So I think that's the beauty of the internet. The only way you can really totally control it is to disconnect. But do you really want to disconnect from the network? Because Yeah,
Well, in
yeah,
times of crisis, governments will do anything to maintain their position of power and privilege.
yeah,
You saw this with the Arab Spring uprisings, where governments just switched off the internet and the mobile phone systems, and people were unable to communicate with each other. And so there were total blackouts occurring at those times. Not sustainable for the long run, but as soon as they'd achieved stability, then they switched them back on again.
yeah. That's why we need. I think someone was. I hope they didn't stop the project. I know someone working on mesh networks where we could just link to each other. Like you don't have to go through your provider.
Yeah,
So like if my mobile phone will recognize you, and we can link to each other, phone to phone. That's possible. So I think that should be a good backup, so that citizens can maintain their own internet. You know.
right.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
that's a good project for people to have,
something with Bluetooth, perhaps,
or even Wi-Fi, because
yeah,
you can just have. If you open up the Wi-Fi in each house, you can just can create,
create a network. Yeah,
yeah, within the neighborhood, and then yeah.
yeah. Very interesting, isn't it? And so here we are talking about solutions to centralization by government
Yeah,
and um, and the doublespeak and
yeah,
of 1984. So yeah,
yeah, and yeah, and I think really 1984 is about that they're trying to control people by controlling what they think, what they can say, by controlling their bodies, having them under 24-hour surveillance, controlling their emotions by making them hate the enemy, and then
exactly. Yeah,
there's that in chapter 2. That was a very poignant part wherein the kids were kicking him and you're a traitor. They were. I think it's the same way where people are being radicalized. Like let's
exactly.
say with
Yeah.
ISIS and all that, they radicalize the young people to grow up hating.
Mm.
Yeah.
Winston makes the point of having 4 square inches of
Yeah.
space
That's
inside his
all the
mind.
freedom you have.
That's all the freedom he has. How sad is that? Um,
Yeah, and
that that
actually,
is
yeah, yeah,
that is not human flourishing.
yeah, and I was just gonna. I had an amazing quote that I want to read, and I also find that when he was trying to rewrite that certain news, and he said, if you want to make it credible, it's harder to fabricate. So it's better to actually create a really outrageous lie from scratch. Because if you base something on a part truth, then you have to recreate the artifacts. So he just created this Ogilvy guy out of thin air because that's easier than to actually
Mm.
link it to the past. So yeah, yeah, and then yeah, I want to read this where he wrote where he wrote to the future or to the past, to a time when thought is free, when men are different from one another and do not live alone, to a time when truth exists and what is done cannot be undone. From the age of uniformity, from the age of solitude, from the age of Big Brother, from the age of doublethink, greetings.
Greetings. Very good.
Yeah, so that's why I think to explain to the viewers, that's why we're against any kind of suppression, even if what you're suppressing seems to be really bad or really against the current thing. It's good as long as they don't cross the line. It's good to keep the conversation happening. It's good
Mm.
to keep the diversity in thinking. Otherwise, we can be like this. We could live in a 1984 world where there's only one truth and it's determined by the people in power, and that's totally dangerous.
Yeah. Coming to a suburb near you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. One last thing. I was just having this chat. I just want to rope in our spiritual because we both had spiritual training, right? And the saddest, I don't know if you've researched about this, but they're saying there might not be a next Dalai Lama because they've killed the country that supports the reincarnation system,
Yep.
because that's a Tibetan thing. It's in the blood of the people. That's where it lands, is through that country, but now it's occupied. How will they find the next reincarnation, right? When the current one dies, it's there's no landing point, or that's one idea there. And the other idea is, I don't know who said it, but someone said that the next Buddha will be a sangha. So the next Buddha won't be one person; it will be like a group, a community. There's something beautiful about that when we're talking about decentralization. No more one guru; it's now a group of people. What's your view on that?
Interesting. Yeah. I've never given it any thought, to be quite honest, but what I have heard, my own readings and research say that someone will come forward, one person in the future. His name will be Maitreya. He'll be known as Maitreya, he or she for that matter. And so Maitreya will be the person who next provides the next great spiritual teachings. And I'm not sure, various dates have been suggested, but to be honest, I don't know how accurate they are. When Krishnamurti was receiving his enlightenment, he met with Buddha, Jesus Christ, and the Maitreya, and sat there conversing with him as part of his enlightenment process. And then, his enlightenment process finished, and that's when he went on to do the things he did, dissolving the order that was sponsoring him, and going off to start his own. Going off to start his own teachings and work. So just an interesting aspect there. So I've not really thought about that. I think I'm too caught up with what's happening in the world in the 21st century and where things are heading for in the immediate future. It's so interesting. It's so fascinating, actually, and such a repetition of history.
And I'm actually thinking when would the archive come in and intervene if it gets too too dangerous. I don't know.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows? Well, it gets dangerous from the moment people can't feed their kids. That's when it starts to get dangerous, and then watch out. And I always look at these preppers on television. There's sometimes these prepping shows, particularly in America, where people are setting up for some sort of apocalypse, and they always strike me as being mad hatters and not quite 100%. Not quite the full loaf of bread. And but maybe they do have something that maybe there is a need to have some level of preparation in your own life, so that you're not dependent on centralized systems for your existence, and just taking that precaution of decentralizing, having a bit of a reserve, all of the usual standard preparation things is actually a good way to move forward in the future.
And in a way, the good side effect of that is you create a backup for civilization, right? Like if so in case the power grid goes down, you can have your own. You know what I mean? It might be helpful for the environment as well, right? You're not too dependent on coal-powered plants and all that.
Exactly.
So even if it didn't happen, it's good as well, right? Because
it comes back to Adam Smith's thing of you following your own best interest and making decisions for yourself that will actually benefit your environment, your community, and so on. So that has to be a good thing.
Yeah. Amazing.
The irony of that is if some sort of scenario like that does start to emerge, then societies actually end up coming back together again out of a sense of self-protection and survival, and re-establishing the old values. And so again, another cycle of human endeavor starts again. So
and people just don't realize how so interdependent we are right now. Like,
absolutely. Yep.
Someone made an art project. He wanted to make a toaster from scratch, and it was impossible.
Yeah. You've seen the movie iPencil?
Yeah.
Maybe you can post it as a link here if people want to watch. you ask yourself, how is a pencil made? And the fact is, there's
Yeah.
thousands of people involved in the manufacture of
So many
one single pencil.
decisions. Yeah,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
it's not centralized, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So
That's
so
what.
interesting.
Yeah, that's what the
Mm.
Soviets found out. You cannot plan an economy. It's too complex. It's too hard
Exactly.
for a group, let alone a person. You know.
Exactly right. Yep.
All right.
Okay.
I think it's a good time to end on this. And yeah.
Good one. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. A part of me wishes that in the next episode there's not another news cycle to talk about. It's like every episode something's happening. It's like what the hell's going on in the world?
It's all going crazy, isn't it? Well, we've got an eclipse happening tomorrow, so Monday the 21st. So that will have a bearing, I'm sure.
Astrologically, yeah. Interesting.
Mm.
Cool. Thank you,
Have a
Peter.
good week. Yep. Take care,
Yeah,
then,
and
Oliver. Yep. And I
see you in the
shall.
next episode.
You bet. Take care.
All right. Thank you for subscribers. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.